Imagine a world where sleep does not exist, where your body fights to rest, yet your mind is trapped, wide awake, with no relief. Imagine the terror of watching days stretch into endless nights, your thoughts twisting into something dark and uncontrollable. This is the story of the Russian sleep experiment, a tale of scientific curiosity gone horrifyingly wrong, a story that has haunted the internet for decades. Tonight, you will hear about men locked in a chamber, kept awake by a mysterious gas, slowly descending into madness. You may never look at sleep the same way again. In the late 1940s, somewhere deep within the Soviet Union, researchers claimed to have discovered a stimulant that could keep a human awake indefinitely. The promise of endless wakefulness fascinated the state, who sought ways to create superhuman soldiers, workers who could operate without pause, without rest, without weakness. 5 political prisoners were selected for a study that would last 15 days. They were promised freedom if they survived, yet no one imagined what awaited them. The chamber was airtight, lined with instruments and monitors, a cold, sterile room designed to observe every movement, every sound. A constant stream of the stimulant gas filled the air, ensuring the subjects could not sleep. Thick metal walls reflected the faint glow of the dim overhead lights. The silence was broken only by the occasional hum of machinery. This was no ordinary experiment. This was a descent into the unknown. At first, the men seemed normal. They talked among themselves, argued, reminisced about the world outside. Their eyes, wide and alert, betrayed no sign of distress. Researchers watched eagerly, taking notes on every heartbeat, every blink, every subtle twitch. Sleep deprivation had begun, but it seemed harmless. As the hours stretched into days, subtle changes began to appear. Whispered arguments erupted over nothing. Shadows seemed to move where no shadow should exist. The men laughed less, stared longer, and began to question the reality outside the chamber. The researchers recorded these changes clinically, unaware that the true horror had only just begun. By the second night, small hints of paranoia surfaced. One man insisted that the gas itself was alive, that it was whispering secrets he could almost understand. Another claimed that the others were plotting against him. Their voices became strained, their eyes darting to corners where no one stood. Yet the researchers remained detached, confident in the science. They did not yet realize that their subjects were beginning to unravel. By the 4th day, the men refused to eat. They whispered constantly, their words fragmented and horrifying, muttering of unseen horrors, of voices that filled the room. Their bodies began to shake with spasms. The stimulant gas kept them awake, but their minds were fraying. Shadows crawled across walls. The researchers debated whether to intervene, each delay feeding the experiment's dark momentum. The men grew increasingly erratic. They began tearing at their clothing, scratching at their skin, scratching at the metal walls as though trying to escape something beyond sight. The cameras captured movements too quick, too sharp, too unnatural. Screams echoed down the hallways, though no one left the chamber. The experiment was becoming something else entirely, a theater of madness, a laboratory of horror. By day 6, the prisoners began to mutilate themselves. One tore at his own arms, another at his face, yet they did not bleed as expected. The researchers were stunned, recording everything meticulously, taking notes that would later haunt anyone who read them. Every attempt to calm the men failed. They became obsessed with staying awake, their bodies betraying them, their minds descending into chaos. By the fourth day, the men refused to eat. They whispered constantly, their words fragmented and horrifying, muttering of unseen horrors, of voices that filled the room. Their bodies began to shake with spasms. The stimulant gas kept them awake, but their minds were fraying. Shadows crawled across walls. The researchers debated whether to intervene, each delay feeding the experiment's dark momentum. The men grew increasingly erratic. They began tearing at their clothing, scratching at their skin, scratching at the metal walls as though trying to escape something beyond sight. The cameras captured movements too quick, too sharp, too unnatural. Screams echoed down the hallways, though no one left the chamber. The experiment was becoming something else entirely, a theater of madness, a laboratory of horror. By day 6, the prisoners began to mutilate themselves. One tore at his own arms, another at his face, yet they did not bleed as expected. The researchers were stunned, recording everything meticulously, taking notes that would later haunt anyone who read them. Every attempt to calm the men failed. They became obsessed with staying awake, their bodies betraying them, their minds descending into chaos. By the 8th day, the men had completely stopped talking to one another. Instead, they whispered constantly to themselves, muttering words that the researchers could not decipher. Their voices were low, urgent, almost pleading, as though communicating with something invisible. The gas had not only robbed them of sleep, it had opened a door in their minds that should have remained closed. Their skin, once pale from confinement, now glistened with a strange sheen, slick and unnatural. Eyes bulged from their sockets, unblinking, reflecting the harsh light of the chamber. The researchers began to notice something alarming. The men no longer responded in any predictable way. They would scream suddenly, then lapse into eerie silence. They would attempt to flee, but only ran in circles, trapped by their own minds. By day 9, the changes became grotesque. One man had carved strange symbols into the metal walls with his fingernails. Another had removed a patch of his own skin, revealing tissue that seemed almost wrong, as though it had hardened in the absence of sleep. The researchers hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. The notes from the control room reflect a chilling detachment. They were scientists observing variables, not humans witnessing suffering. But even their clinical minds couldn't ignore the growing sense of evil in that chamber. By the 11th day, the men had stopped eating entirely. They did not respond to the gas with physical weakness, but their bodies betrayed them in other ways. Tremors shook their limbs, eyes rolled in unnatural directions, and their voices, once whispered, now rose into terrifying choruses of guttural, inhuman sounds. The chamber, once a sterile environment, now felt alive with darkness. Every shadow seemed to pulse, and the machines that monitored them emitted a low hum, almost a chant, accompanying the prisoners' descent into madness. They began speaking of the impossible, claiming that the chamber itself was conscious, that it hungered for their minds, that sleep was a poison they had learned to resist. Researchers recorded every horrific detail. One camera captured a man attempting to climb the walls, as though he believed the room itself would accept him. Another appeared to speak with his own reflection in the polished metal surface, arguing with someone invisible. The lines between sanity and insanity had dissolved entirely.
By the 15th day, the chamber was a theater of unimaginable horror. The men had mutilated themselves beyond recognition, yet their movements remained purposeful, deliberate, and terrifyingly intelligent. They did not bleed as expected. Their cries were inhuman. The researchers attempted to remove them, but one man lunged violently, screaming about the eternal wakefulness, about the voices that would never let him sleep. By the time the room was secured, the experiment had left an indelible mark. The survivors, if they could even be called that, were inhuman shells of men, their minds irreparably twisted. The researchers documented everything meticulously, but their notes are sparse with the terror they must have felt. The Russian sleep experiment had succeeded in proving one thing.